At my daughter's graduation, my husband stood up in front of our friends, colleagues, donors, neighbors, and people who had known us for decades and announced without hesitation that he was leaving me for a woman younger than our child, and he did it with the confidence of a man who believed the moment belonged to him, and that I would either collapse into tears, beg him to reconsider, or explode in a way that would make him look justified. But instead I smiled calmly, reached into my bag, and handed him a yellow envelope, and when he opened it, his face did not just change, it collapsed, and the scream that came out of him was not anger or shock, but raw fear, the kind that strips a person down to their bones and echoes across a stadium. And before I explain how a powerful venture capitalist ended up on his knees in a parking lot, I need to explain who I am and how we got there, because moments like that are never accidents, they are consequences. And my name is Regina. I am 42 years old, and I had spent most of my adult life mastering the art of control, not the loud kind, but the quiet, precise kind that keeps systems running, and people believing everything is fine. I am a senior corporate partner at one of the most aggressive law firms in Atlanta, specializing in hostile takeovers, the kind where fortunes are won and lost in conference rooms without anyone raising their voice. My husband Terrence built his reputation as a venture capitalist, and together we looked like the definition of success in Buckhead. We had the estate, the cars, the charity boards, and the kind of marriage people pointed at and admired from a distance. Our daughter, Maya, was graduating with honors from Spelman College that day, and to the outside world, we were a perfect family, but the truth had been rotting quietly for years, and I did not realize how close we were to collapse until that sun-drenched afternoon in the stadium, when the Georgia heat pressed down on everyone like a physical weight, and I was sitting alone in the VIP section, fanning myself with the graduation program, saving the seat beside me for Terrence for nearly an hour, politely declining when other parents asked if they could sit there, because I believed even then that he would arrive late but arrive nonetheless. And when the murmurs started behind me and the air shifted, I turned and saw him walking down the aisle in a tailored Italian suit, sunglasses on like he was entering a private club, and not his daughter's graduation, and hanging off his arm was a woman who looked no older than 28, wearing a bright red dress completely inappropriate for an academic ceremony, and I recognized her instantly from social media. Bianca, a so-called life coach who posted mostly bikini photos and captions about manifestation and luxury living, and when they stopped at my row, Terrence did not look at me. He reached across, took my handbag from the empty seat, and dropped it onto my lap, telling Bianca to sit there like I was invisible. And when I whispered his name, asking him what he was doing and reminding him where we were, he told me to lower my voice and stop, embarrassing him, saying Bianca was there for moral support, and that I should just watch the ceremony and be quiet. And the disrespect hit me harder than any insult ever had, because it was public, deliberate, and calculated, and around us I could feel the attention, the glances, the whispers from people who knew us professionally, socially, and financially. And I forced myself to stay still, to breathe, and to look forward, because I knew exactly what Terrence wanted, a reaction that would let him control the narrative. And when Maya's name was called and she walked across the stage radiant and proud, I stood clapping with tears in my eyes, while Terrence stood as well, but not to applaud her. Instead, he turned his back to the stage and faced me, and in brief pause between names, he announced loudly that he was done living a lie, that he had sacrificed his happiness for more than 2 decades, and that he was choosing happiness, now choosing Bianca, and filing for divorce on Monday. And the silence that followed was thick and heavy as he stood there, basking in the moment, while Bianca smiled and showed off a diamond ring I recognized instantly, because it was the one I had been shown months earlier when Terrence told me we could not afford it due to market conditions. And in that moment, as the humiliation settled and people stared waiting for my collapse, I looked at the man I had supported through failed ventures, covered debts for protected legally, and built back up every time he stumbled, and I realized he believed I would finally break right there in public. So I smiled calmly, thanked him for his honesty, and reached into my bag, pulling out the yellow manila envelope I had received early that morning from my private investigator, hoping I would not need it that day, and I handed it to him, telling him it was a graduation gift. And when he sneered and tore it open, expecting desperation, instead he found an emergency asset freeze order signed by a judge alongside documentation of tax fraud and embezzlement, including a failed wire transfer from earlier that morning, and the color drained from his face as his knees buckled, and the sound he made was not dignified or controlled, it was primal as he dropped to the concrete, clutching the papers, screaming no, while Bianca panicked, asking what was happening, and I calmly informed him that not only were the joint accounts frozen, but so were the offshore accounts and the shell company registered in Bianca's name, and that the Internal Revenue Service had questions about the $2 million moved earlier that day, and I did not wait for the rest of the ceremony. I walked out of the stadium with my head high, because I knew what was coming next, and I drove straight home, adrenaline steadying my hands, because Terrence was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. And when I pulled into our Buckhead estate, I moved quickly, disabling his access, changing codes, calling the locksmith, and stripping his belongings from the house methodically, not destroying anything, simply removing them and placing them neatly by the curb, because I understood the law and I understood him. And when he arrived later, furious with his brother-in-law, Brad, demanding entry and shouting that it was his house, I spoke through the intercom, calmly explaining that the property belonged to our daughter's irrevocable trust, and that as trustee I had the legal authority to exclude him. And when Brad froze, realizing I knew about the financial fraud they had been hiding, Terrence tried to soften his tone, pleading and minimizing Bianca as a mistake. But I gave him minutes to leave before I involved law enforcement, and watched him scramble to load his possessions into his car, humiliated and exposed. And as he drove away, I did not feel victory, only exhaustion, because when my phone buzzed with a message from my sister Tasha blaming me for threatening her family, I understood the real war had just begun, and that Terrence would not stop with money. He would come for my reputation, my career, and most painfully my relationship with our daughter. And as if summoned by that thought, I heard the front door open and saw Maya, still in her graduation gown, holding her phone with Bianca's live stream, playing, her face wet with tears and anger, as she accused me of cruelty and vindictiveness, and sided with her father, believing his lies. And when she stormed out of the house to go to him, I stood alone in silence, knowing that the envelope had only ended the illusion of our marriage, not the battle itself. And as I opened the safe in my office and looked at the notebook filled with names, dates, and bribe amounts, I accepted that if they wanted to destroy me, I would expose everything, because I had not spent my life learning the rules to lose to people who thought manipulation was power. Maya came through the front door with tears in her eyes and her graduation gown still clinging to her frame like a memory she was desperate to shed, and I barely had time to breathe her name before she screamed at me, her voice echoing through the foyer, filled with rage, confusion, and heartbreak. And when I opened my arms to comfort her, she stepped back like I was the villain in her story, and said, "Daddy told me everything, that you locked him out, froze his accounts, tried to ruin him." And she asked me how I could be so cruel, how I could do something so hateful on her graduation day. And when I told her that her father had broken the law and betrayed our family, she shouted that he had only fallen in love, and that I was the one tearing everything apart. And the diploma she had been holding slipped from her hands, and the glass shattered against the marble floor, as if that single gesture symbolized the destruction of her childhood. And when she said she was going to stay with her father because he needed her more than I did, she slammed the door behind her and left me standing in the same silence I had just escaped from at the stadium. And I looked down at the broken glass, thinking how much easier it would have been if Terrence had simply stabbed me, because at least that kind of pain would have made sense. And the truth was, I had anticipated his attack on our finances, our property, even my career. But I had not expected him to turn our daughter into a weapon. And as I stood there, in the emptiness of a house I no longer recognized, I realized he would stop at nothing, not even Maya, and that thought filled me with a clarity that I had not felt in days, because now I knew exactly how far I would have to go. And I walked straight to my home office, picked up the phone, and told my investigator to dig deep, not just into Bianca's financial history, but into everything, her exes, her sealed court records, that suspicious Florida expungement she thought no one knew about, and told him I wanted the kind of file that could turn a wedding into a crime scene. And when I hung up the phone, I stared at my reflection in the darkened screen of my laptop and reminded myself that the stadium was just the first punch, and that now I had to fight back, and not just for my assets or my pride, but for my daughter who was walking into her father's trap believing he was a victim. And when I closed my eyes, I saw her face, saw the tears streaming down her cheeks when she screamed that I was destroying everything, and I remembered the nights I stayed up tutoring her through finals, the mornings I made her breakfast while prepping for court, the sacrifices I made while Terrence played the visionary. And I told myself that this was not about revenge, it was about rescue, and I had to save Maya before he broke her the way he tried to break me. And later that night, I found myself watching Bianca's live video as she sobbed to tens of thousands of followers claiming to be bullied by a bitter ex-wife who had frozen all their accounts and left them penniless, and people were commenting, offering money, sympathy, prayers, calling me a monster, a hag, a control freak. And I watched it all quietly, noting the names, the lies, the angles, because I knew she was not just playing the victim, she was setting stage for a smear campaign, and I would not let her win. And when I heard the door slam again, this time softer, I turned to see Maya returning, holding her phone, her face twisted with anger and grief, because she had just watched that video and believed every word. And when she confronted me again, accusing me of starving her father out of taking joy in his suffering, I told her the truth plainly, that her father had emptied our accounts, tried to steal from the trust I built for her, and that Bianca was using her as a pawn. But she did not want the truth, not then, not yet, and she shouted that I was lying, that I was bitter jealous, that I hated seeing her father happy. And when she ran up the stairs sobbing, I stood still, not because I was numb, but because I was processing, and I knew that every word Bianca had said was rehearsed, calculated, and designed to poison Maya's love for me. And I realized that the courtroom would not be the only battlefield, that this war would be fought in the hearts of those I loved, and that I could not afford to lose. And hours passed, and I heard nothing from Maya, and I waited and waited, hoping she would come down and ask questions, listen, consider, but the house remained silent, and in that silence I felt something solidify, not despair but resolve. And I walked into my office, opened the safe, and pulled out the notebook I had kept hidden for months, filled with Terrence's secrets, the deals he made off the books, the payments to silent partners, the shady back channels used to mask his illegal transfers. And I placed it on my desk and began organizing my next legal move. And just as I started writing, I heard my phone buzz, and I looked down to see a message from a friend at the bank, a digital alert showing that someone had attempted to access one of trust accounts using new credentials, and the timestamp matched the exact moment Maya had left the house. And I knew without a doubt that Terrence had sent her to steal from me, that he had used our daughter to breach the system, and that realization hardened something inside me. And when I called bank to confirm the attempt, I learned that someone had presented a temporary power of attorney form, supposedly signed by Maya, and my hands went cold because I knew her signature, and I knew what Terrence had done. And the next morning I went to the firm early before the staff arrived, sat in the boardroom, and reviewed every document related to the trust. And then I called the family court clerk and filed an emergency motion to revoke any unauthorized access and to flag Maya's signature for verification on all future filings. And I did not blame her, I blamed him, because I could see the strings and the puppet master behind them. And when I got home that evening, the house was too quiet again, and Maya's door was open, and her room was empty, and the only thing left behind was the orange shopping bag with the Hermes logo. And I stood there staring at it, realizing she had taken the bait and gone back to him. And I sat down on her bed, looked at the sheets still warm from her body, and I made a promise to her and to myself that no matter what it took, I would bring her back, not by force, not by guilt, but by showing her the truth. And that meant I had to dismantle the illusion brick by brick, in court, in public, and in private, because I would not let Terrence use our daughter as a shield and a sword. And when the sun went down and the lights outside flickered on, I picked up my phone again and called the investigator and told him to prioritize any photos or documents that could prove Bianca's criminal past, and I gave him permission to dig as deep as necessary, and he said he would start with Miami and a man named Dante, whose name had come up in a sealed affidavit, and as I hung up, I looked out the window of my office and saw the driveway still empty, no Maya, no Terrence, and I whispered into the darkness that they had made their first move, and now it was my turn. I stood outside Maya's dorm building, staring at the faded brick exterior, while the warm breeze of early June rustled the leaves above me, trying to gather myself for the conversation I knew would tear something inside me loose once again. Maya was finishing up some things in her room, and I had offered to take her out for coffee, just the two of us, a mother and daughter moment before the whirlwind of family drama swept us into its current. But when the door finally opened, it was not Maya who stepped out first, it was Bianca, and seeing her again in the light of day without the buffer of a crowd or ceremony made the ache in my chest flare hot. And while she was wearing leggings and a cropped sweatshirt like a teenager, her long nails clicking against the plastic cup in her hand, the moment she saw me her lips twisted into something between a smirk and a warning. She did not speak. She simply brushed past me, bumping my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble slightly. I caught myself and said nothing, refusing to give her the satisfaction. Maya stepped out seconds later, her face flushed and eyes red as if she had just been crying. She wrapped her arms around me tightly, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed, like I was still her hero, her protector. But that illusion shattered the second she pulled away and said, "We need to talk, Mom." We sat at the corner table of a quiet coffee shop on campus, the hum of espresso machines in the background. I let Maya speak first because I could see she had something heavy on her heart, and I knew if I interrupted it might never come out. She kept fidgeting with the cardboard sleeve around her drink. Finally she looked up and said, "Dad told me everything." Her voice cracked, and I felt my stomach drop. "Maya, he lied," I began, but she shook her head. "I know he's not perfect," she said, "but he said you froze the accounts and that the firm might go under, that you are trying to destroy him." I swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. "I am protecting what is ours, Maya. He tried to move millions into a private account behind my back, brought another woman to your graduation, and announced he was leaving me. That is not love, that is cruelty." Maya looked down, ashamed, maybe confused. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. I saw the ring on her finger, the expensive bag slung over her chair. I recognized the signs of manipulation, the way Terrence would bait you with affection, then guilt, then money. She was caught in it. Now I reached across the table and held her hand. "You don't have to choose sides," I said gently, "but you need to understand that your father is not the man you think he is." Later that evening, I sat alone in my home office, the walls lined with legal books that suddenly felt like hollow trophies. I was supposed to be a fighter, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of Atlanta's legal scene. But tonight I felt like a shell. I opened the envelope from the private investigator I had hired and pulled out a series of photographs. They were all of Bianca in different cities with different men, one in Miami, another in New Orleans, another in Las Vegas, all using different names, all showing the same pattern: a man with money, a few months of passion, then disappearance. The last photo was her at a jewelry store in Buckhead, looking at the exact ring now on her finger in the graduation photo, with Terrence. The timestamp read 2 months before our anniversary. I closed the file and sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I had been so blind. The doorbell rang, breaking silence. I walked to the door and opened it to find my sister Tasha standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me and walked straight to the kitchen. "We need to talk," she said urgently. "Brad is losing it. He said Terrence is going to ruin all of us if you don't unfreeze the assets." I leaned against the counter, arms folded. I had expected this. I had warned them all. Tasha poured herself a glass of water, her hands shaking. "Regina, please. He is threatening to fire Brad and close the firm. He says you are going nuclear and that this is about revenge, not business." I laughed bitterly. "Revenge is when you act from emotion," I said. "What I am doing is legal, strategic, and absolutely justified." Tasha looked at me as if I was a stranger. "I paid for her college. I gave her a down payment for her house, and now she stood here defending the man who betrayed me." because it affected her lifestyle. I walked to the living room and picked up the folder from the table. I handed it to her. Look at this, I said. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the photographs, her mouth falling open, her eyes growing wider with each one. She stopped at the last photo and whispered, "Oh my God, that is the ring he gave her." Tasha sat down hard on the couch, the folder still open in her lap. "Regina, you have to go public with this," she said, her voice urgent. "If this comes out quietly, they will control the narrative. You need to show everyone who she really is." I nodded. I was already planning to do exactly that. I reached for my laptop and opened the presentation I had been working on. It was a clean professional slideshow with bullet points, names, dates, and photographs, a clear timeline of deceit. I was going to expose them both, and I was going to do it with the full force of the truth. I stared at the screen, thinking about the graduation, thinking about the way Terrence had smirked when he made that announcement, thinking about the way Bianca had looked down on me like I was already discarded. They thought they had won, but I was just getting started. I leaned back in my chair and whispered, "Let the games begin." The next day, I received a message from Maya. She wanted to meet again, this time at her favorite brunch spot from childhood. I arrived early, sitting in the booth where we used to split pancakes and giggle about nothing. She walked in wearing sunglasses, her expression unreadable. She slid into the booth and didn't speak for a while. Finally, she said, "I read the file. Dad left it on the dining table." I saw everything. I waited, unsure what her reaction would be. She took off her glasses, and I saw tears in her eyes. "I am sorry, Mom," she said. "I didn't want to believe it, but now I do. He used me." She took a shaky breath. "I signed a document. He gave me something about Grandma's surgery. He said he needed my signature to access emergency funds. I didn't read it. I just signed because I wanted to help." I reached out and took her hands. "It's okay, Meyer," I said softly. "You are not to blame. He manipulated you like he manipulates everyone, but now you know the truth." Maya wiped her eyes and nodded. "What do we do now?" she asked. I looked her in the eye. "We take back everything he stole, and we make sure he never does this to anyone else again." That night, I filed necessary legal actions to initiate an injunction. Not only was Terrence going to be unable to touch another dime, he was also going to be served with a restraining order preventing him from contacting Maya without my consent. I was no longer playing defense. I was going on the offensive. I drafted a formal letter to the board of his company detailing his fraudulent attempts to move assets using forged consent and manipulation of a dependent family member, and included the images of Bianca from the private investigator. My hands did not tremble as I typed my name at the bottom. I had spent decades playing by the rules, believing in fairness, but now I saw that justice did not live in courtrooms. It lived in truth and the courage to wield it without fear. Terrence had tried to destroy me publicly. Now it was my turn, and I would do it with facts, evidence, and absolute composure. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a strange sense of calm, like something within me had clicked back into place. Not the rage, not the heartbreak, just the quiet certainty of a woman who had survived the fire and emerged sharper than steel. The day the court notice arrived, I was standing in the kitchen pouring tea, the morning light pouring in through the windows, making everything feel like a cruel joke. The envelope was thick, official, and cold. I already knew what it was before I opened it. Terrence had filed an emergency petition, claimed the house, citing business necessity and temporary occupancy as his reason. I sat down at the table and stared at the pages, the arrogance in the language, the entitlement, as if I was a squatter in my own home, as if I had not helped build every inch of it. I took a deep breath and placed papers aside. There would be no reaction, no panic. I had learned by now that responding emotionally only gave him more control. Instead, I reached for my phone, called my attorney, and calmly said, "We move forward. I want no delays." I knew Terrence expected a reaction. He wanted me to run to him or beg, even explode, so he could say, "Look how irrational she is," but he would get silence and precision instead. The following week, I attended a preliminary hearing alone, dressed in a navy suit, with my hair pulled back tight and my heels clicking against the marble floor with every step like a war drum. Terrence arrived 15 minutes late in a designer suit with Bianca clinging to his arm. She wore a fitted cream dress and oversized sunglasses. Inside the courthouse, like it was a movie set. The clerk called the case number, and we entered the chamber. Bianca tried to follow Terrence in, but was Stopped at the door, she huffed and pulled out her phone, pretending not to care as the doors shut behind us. Terrence sat beside his attorney, a man I had once had lunch with at a bar association gala years ago. I did not flinch. The judge entered, an older man with sharp eyes and a tired tone. He read through the documents, nodded, and then turned his gaze toward me. Ms. Wallace, I understand you have documentation of asset movement, attempted fraud and ownership history. I do your honor, I replied, my voice even and low, and I have filed a restraining order request regarding inappropriate third-party influence on my daughter's legal involvement. The judge raised his brows and asked for clarification. I explained in clear detail how Maya had unknowingly signed a document under duress, given false pretenses by her father. The judge listened carefully, scribbled notes, and then looked back at Terrence's lawyer. Do you wish to contest that? The man cleared his throat and mumbled, we would like time to review that claim, of course. I thought he would. The judge set the next hearing date for 3 weeks from that day and instructed both parties to maintain current occupancy status. No one moves in, no one moves out until further notice. As I stood to leave, Terrence leaned slightly toward me and whispered, this is not over, Regina, but I did not look at him. I walked out with my head held high outside the courtroom. Bianca rushed over to him like a desperate shadow, wrapping her arms around his waist and asking what happened. He hissed something in her ear, and they walked off like a couple stepping off a yacht, not a battlefield. I returned home and found Tasha waiting for me in the kitchen again. She looked pale again, this time her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something I had not seen before. Guilt. She confessed that Terrence had called her, told her to convince me to drop everything. He was threatening to expose things from the past, things that were personal, things I had only shared with family. And I realized then that Terrence had kept records of everything, every conversation, every weak moment, and now he was using them. I closed the refrigerator door calmly and said, let him try. I am not afraid of my past, only of letting him twist the future. Tasha began to cry softly and said, I am sorry, I was scared. I should have never believed he would spare us. I nodded, did not offer comfort. This was the cost of loyalty misplaced. A few days later, I sat with Maya again, this time at her apartment. She had invited me over to talk, and I could sense the conflict in her. She served tea and sat cross-legged on the couch, her face serious. Mom, she began quietly, Bianca came by last night. She wanted to talk to me about Dad. I waited, listening. Maya said she told me to convince you to back off or else. I asked what else meant. Maya hesitated, then said she mentioned things about you and Dad's past fights, about money, about some incident from years ago when you took time off firm. She said she had proof, emails, recordings, something. I looked at my daughter and said, Meyer, I know exactly what she is talking about. And yes, there was a time many years ago when your father and I went through hardship, but that is not shame, that is life, and it was long before Bianca ever existed. Maya nodded and said, I believe you, Mom. I just needed to hear it from you. I reached out and held her hand and said, no matter how messy this gets, I want you to know that you are the only thing in this world I have ever fought this hard for. You are not a pawn. You are the reason I stay strong. We hugged tightly, and in that moment something changed. She was no longer caught in the middle. She was standing beside me. I left her apartment feeling a calm I had not felt in months. Later that night, my attorney called to inform me that Bianca had filed a harassment complaint against me, citing emotional manipulation toward Maya and public slander due to the investigator's images. I laughed out loud when I heard it. She was grasping now, lashing out in all directions. But I would not break. Instead, I forwarded the complaint to a contact at a legal ethics board, along with a detailed report of manipulation tactics Bianca had used, including the documented aliases and patterns of financial deceit. I did not want vengeance, I wanted accountability. The morning of the next hearing, I arrived early again, the courtroom slowly filled with legal aides, journalists, curious interns. But when the bailiff called the case and the doors opened, Terrence walked in alone. Bianca was not there. I noticed the tightness in his jaw, the nervous way he adjusted his cufflinks. He was unraveling. The judge addressed the room briskly, then turned to my attorney, asking for our filing updates. We provided new financial disclosures pointing out inconsistencies in Terrence's business claims, and included Maya's signed statement explaining how she had been misled by her father's request for her signature. The judge's expression darkened slightly And then he turned to Terrence and said, Mr. Wallace, it appears your request to seize the primary residence is not only baseless, but may have involved coercion. I am recommending this matter move to formal investigation with full discovery pending further evidence. This court cannot approve your motion to assume property. Occupancy status. Hearing adjourned. I felt the weight lift a little as I walked out of the courtroom. I did not smile, but inside I felt the steel return. Terrence remained seated for a long moment, then stood and followed me into the hallway. He called after me, Regina, but I did not stop. I kept walking, heels echoing across the marble. Bianca never showed, and rumors started circling that she had left the city. Later, I would find out that she had emptied a separate account in his name and vanished, booking a one-way ticket to another state. She was not in this for love, she was in it for access, and when it got complicated, she fled. Terrence would try to find her, but she had used a false name at the hotel and vanished into the kind of silence that only someone like her could master. And now he stood alone, not just legally, but publicly, and Maya saw it too. The next morning, Maya sent me a message that simply read, I see it all now, Mom, and I am with you all the way. The day I learned Bianca had emptied Terrence's hidden account and vanished was the day everything began to tilt in my favor, not just in court, but in spirit. I found out from a friend in finance who tracked flight purchases for fraud alerts and saw the transaction to a private hotel in Arizona made under a name Bianca used years ago on a college ID. When I showed the proof to my attorney, he simply said poetic justice, and I agreed, but I was not celebrating, not yet, because even if she was gone, the damage she caused was still crawling through every part of our lives. Terrence was now erratic, cornered like an animal whose ally had fled and left him naked in the spotlight. He came to the next hearing with no attorney, only a file folder and shaky hands. He tried to speak on his own behalf, but the judge shut him down, saying, This is not a self-representation hearing, sir. You were advised to retain counsel. And so the hearing was postponed again, this time for 2 weeks, the judge's patience clearly waning outside the courtroom. Terrence approached me again, his eyes blood-shot, his voice low. He said, You win. Okay, I am done. Just stop digging. I stared at him for a long moment and said, This was never about winning. This was about truth and protecting what you tried to destroy. The next few days were strange, quiet, almost like the eye of a storm. Maya visited me more often. We cooked together, something we had not done in years. She told me about her internship, her plans to apply to graduate programs, and one night she said, Mom, do you think Dad ever really loved you? I paused before answering, and then I said, I think your father loved the idea of me, but not the reality. And when the reality did not serve him anymore, he tried to replace it with a lie. Maya looked at me for a long time and said, I think I finally understand what you mean. The next week, Terrence filed a motion to sell the house, citing financial pressure and business obligations. But I had anticipated that, and my attorney filed a block citing joint ownership, emotional distress, and pending ethical investigations, and the judge sided with us again, ordering no action be taken regarding sale until final ruling was delivered. Terrence was losing not just in court, but in every corner of the life he thought he controlled. One morning, Maya sent me a photo. It was of Bianca's car abandoned in a parking lot at a hotel, where she had stayed for 2 nights and then vanished. She left no contact, no forwarding address, and when Terrence tried calling her, he got a disconnected tone. I told Maya to stay away from that story. It was not our mess anymore. A few days later, I found a letter slipped through my mailbox. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Terrence. He wrote that he was sorry not for what he had done, but for what it had become. He blamed Bianca, he blamed pressure, he blamed everything but himself, and ended the letter with a line that burned into my memory. I thought I was building a future, but all I did was light a match. I folded the letter and placed it into my file of evidence, not because I needed it legally, but because I wanted to remember exactly who I had been fighting this whole time. At the final pre-trial hearing, the courtroom was packed, journalists, interns, legal observers, all waiting to see how the once respected businessman and his wife, now adversaries, would battle it out. But when the clerk called our case, Terrence stood and said, Your Honor, I would like to settle the room. Hush. The judge blinked and asked him to clarify, and Terrence said, I am withdrawing my claims. I Concede property division as proposed by the petitioner and request only visitation schedule be addressed. The judge turned to me and asked Ms. Wallace, do you accept these terms? And I said I do, but with one condition. The judge asked what that was, and I replied that visitation be limited until a full psychological evaluation is completed due to past coercive behavior toward our daughter and potential emotional harm. Maya was in the courtroom sitting in the back, and I could see her nod quietly. The judge took a breath, looked at both of us, and then said, motion granted. I will draft the order accordingly. And with that, it was over, just like that. Months of pain, of fear, of battle, reduced to a few lines on a legal pad. As we exited the courtroom, Terrence did not speak. He simply walked past me out into the hallway where reporters had gathered. Someone shouted, Mr. Wallace, do you have a comment? And he kept walking, head down, suit wrinkled, tie loose, like a man whose empire had cracked and fallen silently that night. I sat on my porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind rustle the leaves, and I thought of all the versions of myself I had buried to survive this fight. The young wife once believed in Terrence, the mother who had to shield her child from lies, the lawyer who had to become a warrior, and now the woman who stood alone but whole again. Maya joined me on the porch and handed me a cup of tea. She said, you did it, Mom. And I said, no, we did it, because every time I wanted to give up, I saw your face and remembered why I started the next morning. I began the process of moving forward, not just emotionally, but literally. I renovated the kitchen, changed the paint in the bedroom, sold the furniture Terrence picked out, and replaced it with soft colors, things that felt like me. Again, Maya helped, and together we laughed more than we had in years. We even started looking at vacation spots for a mother-daughter trip, something we had promised to do when she was 10, but life got in the way, and now it was time to reclaim that promise. One afternoon, Maya found an old photo in a drawer. It was of the three of us from her kindergarten graduation, Terrence holding her hand, me adjusting her gown. We both stared at it for a long time, and then Maya said, I do not remember this day, and I said maybe it is better that way, because now we get to make new memories, ones that no one can take away from us. As spring turned to summer, the house felt lighter, not just in decoration, but in energy. It was no longer a battleground, it was a sanctuary, and for the first time in a long time I slept without waking in fear of what tomorrow might bring. And when Maya finally walked across the stage at her university graduation months later, I was there front row, clapping with tears in my eyes, and as she looked at me and smiled, I knew that no matter how many storms we had weathered, nothing could take that moment away from us. And in that second, I also knew that healing was not a destination, but a choice, a daily choice, and I was ready to keep choosing it. After the court hearing ended and Terrence conceded to all terms and walked out of the courtroom in silence, it felt like the kind of victory that did not come with cheers or trophies, but with breath, the kind of breath you had not realized you had been holding for years. And when I stepped out into the hallway with Maya walking beside me, I could feel that weight lifting. The years of being doubted, silenced, manipulated, pushed into corners, and made to question my own reflection were behind me now, and what remained was the slow crawl back into the light where I could recognize my own voice again. We did not say anything on the drive home. We just listened to the sound of the tires moving over the road, and the occasional gust of wind outside the car window, like the universe itself was exhaling beside us. Maya held my hand halfway through the ride, and I gripped it gently because that hand had grown from a little girl's palm into a young woman's strength, and that strength had saved us more than once. I remember parking in the driveway and sitting in the car for a full 5 minutes, staring at the house, the same house that had seen birthday candles blown out, tears cried in locked bathrooms, whispered phone calls during the worst nights, and the quiet ache of keeping up appearances for a man who only saw value when he felt power. And now that power was gone, stripped away not by vengeance, but by truth, and that made it all the more devastating for him. We walked inside together, and I stood in the living room running my fingers across the fireplace mantel, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to feel peace, not joy, not celebration, but peace, the kind that settles over you when you know the worst is over, and what lies ahead might still be hard, but it will be yours to choose. That evening Maya made dinner, and we talked about her research plans, about the program overseas she had been accepted into, and about whether she felt ready to go. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict of wanting to chase dreams, but fearing what might happen if she left me alone, and I told her that I did not raise her to stay stuck. I raised her to fly, to become everything she was meant to be, and she nodded with tears welling in her eyes, but with a smile that said she believed me, and maybe for the first time in a long while she truly trusted that I would be okay. I helped her pack that week, folding jeans and books and small framed photos she wanted to keep with her, and we laughed over old stories and memories from her childhood, memories I had almost forgotten, buried under the weight of court filings, custody threats, and silent dinners. Maya left for the airport in mid-June, her flight scheduled for early morning, and I stood at the security checkpoint watching her wave one last time before disappearing into the gate, and I remember standing there longer than I needed to, the automatic doors opening and closing behind me, while I stood still in a world that suddenly felt very large and very quiet. When I returned home, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window watching the sun rise over the street, and I whispered to myself, "It is your turn now," and I believed it. The first week alone was strange. The house echoed in places that used to be filled with footsteps and voices, and I caught myself speaking out loud sometimes just to make sound exist again. But instead of feeling empty, I began to feel curious. I joined a yoga class at the community center, not because I loved stretching, but because I wanted to be in a room where no one knew my story, where I was not someone's ex-wife or legal case, just a woman trying to touch her toes again. I also began volunteering, helping women who were still in the middle of their storms, some of them with bruises on their arms, some with bruises you could not see but that still throbbed every night when the lights went out. I never told them my whole story. I did not need to. They saw it in my posture and my patience, in the way I listened without trying to fix them. One woman named Erica asked me how I stayed sane through everything, and I told her the truth. I said I wrote letters I never sent. I talked to shadows. I gave myself permission to be angry, and then I gave myself permission to let it go. And when she started crying, I held her hand, and for the first time in months, I felt like my pain had been turned into purpose. That same month, I received an email from an unknown sender. It was not threatening, but it was cruel, accusing me of manipulation, of staging evidence, of corrupting Maya's mind. The grammar and tone were unmistakably Terrence's style, even though the sender name was untraceable. I forwarded it to my lawyer, who submitted it as part of our post-settlement harassment file, and the judge responded by issuing a warning for further contact of any kind, including digital, would result in a restraining order being activated, and I could tell from the silence that followed that Terrence had finally accepted his defeat, though knowing him, he would twist the story in his favor for the next 20 years, painting himself as a victim to anyone who would listen, and I had made peace with that because people who need to lie to survive are already living in cages they built themselves. One morning, I went for a walk in the park and passed by a playground where Maya used to play when she was little, and I sat on the same bench I used to sit on when I watched her slide and swing and laugh before the world taught her that even fathers can break hearts, and I looked up at the sky and thought how many years I spent surviving instead of living, and how many mornings I had left to change. That I made a list that week, not of goals but of promises to myself. I promised I would not apologize for my joy. I promised I would wear colors I used to avoid because Terrence said they made me look washed out. I promised I would take one photo every week of something that made me feel alive, and I promised I would stop waiting for apologies that would never come and start building peace from the pieces I had left. I took up baking again, not professionally, just for fun, and the kitchen began to smell like cinnamon and lemon again, like it used to before we started eating separately in silence. I invited my neighbor over for tea, an elderly woman named Margaret, who had always smiled kindly at me in the driveway, and during our conversation she said, "I always knew there was a fire in you. I just hoped you would remember where you put the matches," and I laughed so hard I spilled honey on the table, but it felt good to laugh without tension, to laugh without someone watching my reaction for weakness. I spent hours in the evenings reading books that had gathered dust on my shelves, stories of women who rose from wreckage, stories that sounded a lot like mine. And one afternoon, I received a package from Meyer a hand-drawn postcard from her trip to Italy with a note that read, "I saw this flower and thought of you. It was growing out of stone and still blooming fiercely." I cried holding that postcard and pinned it to the refrigerator as a reminder that even when things look impossible, something beautiful can still grow. I started planning a trip for myself, a solo journey to a coastal town where no one knew me, where I could sit by the sea and let the waves remind me that time moves forward no matter what we do, and in the process, I would let the water carry away the last bits of fear still clinging to my ribs. I was no longer someone who needed saving. I was someone who had saved herself over and over again, and was finally ready to live, not just survive. After the weeks passed and I began settling into this new version of my life, the silence of the house no longer felt like an enemy. Instead, it became a sort of calm, a healing space where every sound was mine and mine alone. The clink of coffee spoons in the morning, the light creak of floorboards, sigh of wind through the trees outside my window, they all whispered back to me that I had survived, and survival was not something I took lightly, not anymore. I started waking up at sunrise, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see the light begin again, just like I had, and each morning I would make tea and sit on the porch, sometimes barefoot, sometimes wrapped in the old sweater Maya had once gifted me, and I would watch the sun climb over rooftops and think, this is mine, this moment is mine. I went back to painting, a hobby I had once buried under chores, errands, and emotional labor, and with each brushstroke I poured the silence of all those painful years into color, into shape, into breath. I did not paint people, not yet. I painted skies, oceans, fields, trees, places I had only seen in books, but now longed to see with my own eyes. It was as if I was giving myself destinations to reach, even if only on canvas, and slowly the house filled with them, like I was building windows into freedom. I had never known Terrence stayed silent, not a single call, not a text, not even the passive-aggressive emails I half expected. He had always used silence as a weapon, but this time it was different. This time his silence meant he knew he lost, not just in court, but in every corner where truth still mattered. One afternoon, I walked past the mirror in the hallway, and I stopped not because I looked tired or broken, but because I looked like me again, the version of me before the disappointments, before the dismissals, before the day he made that announcement at our daughter's graduation. And I stared at myself, not out of vanity, but out of recognition, like seeing an old friend return from war. I was proud of that woman in the reflection, the one who stayed, the one who fought, the one who refused to become bitter even when it would have been easy. I remember the first time I laughed without hesitation. It was in the grocery store. I was buying fruit, and a little girl in front of me dropped an orange, and it rolled all the way down the aisle. Her laugh was so loud, so free, and so honest that I laughed. And I remember the cashier looking up surprised and smiling, and I thought, when did I stop doing that? When did joy become something I rationed like medicine? That day I bought sunflowers for no reason other than they looked like hope, and I placed them in the center of my kitchen table so that even when the days were long or the nights felt heavy, something bright waited for me in the morning. I received a letter, a real one, not digital, with a stamp, and my name handwritten on the envelope. It was from Maya. She had been gone 3 weeks now, studying abroad, exploring museums, taking photos of statues and fountains and architecture that she had only read about before, and her letter was full of wonder and discovery. And at the end she wrote, "Mom, I can breathe here, and I know you can too, wherever you are. Find your air." And I sat with that letter pressed to my chest like a shield, like a reminder that freedom is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet and steady, and it grows the way light creeps into dark rooms. I signed up for a creative writing course at the local college, not because I wanted to publish anything, but because I wanted to find my voice again. I had spent so long speaking in ways that would not cause waves, keeping the peace, biting my tongue, and now it was time to speak, even if no one read it, even if the words were just for me. The class was small, mostly women of different ages and backgrounds, and we sat in a circle each week sharing stories, some fictional, some painfully real. And when I read my first piece aloud, my hands trembled, but my voice did not. And when I finished, one woman leaned over and whispered, "You made me feel seen." And I nodded, because that was all I ever wanted to feel and to give. I began noticing how many things I had ignored for years. How the couch cushions were always slightly uneven, how the garden had weeds that no one pulled, how the air in the hallway felt still like it was waiting, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt invited. I rearranged furniture, not out of need, but out of joy. I planted herbs and flowers and tomatoes. Even though I had no idea what I was doing, and every little leaf that pushed through the soil felt like a small rebellion against everything that tried to bury me, I painted the hallway light blue, and for the first time that hallway felt open, like it breathed with me. I went to the bookstore and bought novels. I had once told myself I did not have time for stories of women who started over, of women who did not have neat endings but kept walking anyway, and I saw myself in every one of them, in the lines between words and the silences they endured, and overcame. One day I found an old notebook tucked away in the back of my closet. It was a journal I had started in 2010 and only wrote in sporadically. Most of the pages were blank, but the few entries there were raw, aching, confused. They were filled with questions like, why does he make me feel so small? Or when did I become someone he does not see? And I sat on the floor reading those entries, and I cried, not out of sadness but out of awe, because that woman who wrote those things was still here, and she had found her way out. The journal was not a map, but it was proof that I had always known deep down that I deserved more, and now I finally had it. I began cooking again, not the rushed meals I used to prepare under stress, but real meals with flavor and love, and I invited people over, old friends who had quietly waited for me to return to myself, and new ones I met through classes or community events, and the laughter around my table sounded like healing, like music made of moments that could never be taken away. And I realized I had not just escaped something bad, I had stepped into something good. I stopped checking his social media pages, stopped wondering what story he was spinning, or who believed him. It no longer mattered, because my truth was no longer hidden. It lived in every breath I took, in every peaceful night I slept through, in every painting I hung on my walls. I kept Maya's photo on my nightstand, and sometimes when I missed her, I would speak out loud and tell her what I had done that day, and I liked to imagine her listening, smiling, proud. I started to feel less like a survivor and more like a creator of my own life, not just reacting, but choosing, building, dreaming. And every day that passed, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger, a little more like the woman I was always meant to be. And one evening, while watching the sunset spill orange and pink across the sky, I whispered thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe, or maybe to the version of myself that had never given up. And I meant it deeply, fully, without regret. I had found peace, not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer afraid of imperfection, because I had faced the storm, and now I stood in the sun. The days started rolling into each other like soft waves, and even though I had found some form of peace, a quiet routine that did not revolve around pain or judgment or walking on eggshells, there was still one last thread that had not been tied. Maya was coming back soon, and I felt a mixture of joy, nerves, and something deeper that I could not quite name. I missed her voice, her footsteps, the way she used to hum while brushing her hair. I had written letters, sent photos of my paintings, and updates about small joys, like when I finally fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen by myself, or when I found our old picnic blanket tucked behind the dryer. But now that she was returning, I wondered if she would recognize this new version of me, or if I would recognize the new her. The airport was full of people that day, travelers reuniting, lovers hugging, strangers crying, and in the middle of it all I stood with my heart thudding like it had not done in months. And then I saw her, Maya, walking toward me with that same confident stride, the same fire in her eyes. But there was something new too, something freer. We hugged for a long time, longer than needed, but not nearly long enough. And in that moment, I felt everything fall back into place, not because we were going back to who we used to be, but because we were stepping forward together into whatever came next. We talked all the way home. She told me about museums that made her cry and old streets that smelled of fresh bread and stories she had collected like treasures, and I told her about the silence, the laughter, the flowers, and the strength I did not know I had. And for the first time in years we spoke not as mother and daughter bound by survival, but as two women who had each saved themselves in different ways. At dinner, she looked around the house, Her eyes catching on the blue hallway. The new couch covers the rows of herbs on the windowsill, and she smiled, "Mom, it feels like home now." And I replied, "Because it is, because we made it ours again." We spent the next few days catching up, walking through the park, eating ice cream, sitting on the porch at night watching stars and sharing stories. She asked me questions she had not asked before, not just about the divorce, but about the years before, about how I had stayed, how I had held on, and I answered with honesty, not bitterness. I told her that sometimes love is not enough to keep someone kind, and that sometimes strength is quiet and slow and invisible, but it carries you through anyway. I showed her my paintings, and she pointed to one of a quiet beach with pink skies, and said, "This one feels like you." And I knew exactly what she meant. The visit was not just a reunion, it was a healing. Every laugh, every shared meal, every walk through the neighborhood was another stitch in the fabric we were mending together. One afternoon, we sat on the porch with lemon tea, and I asked her, "Do you hate him?" And she thought for a long time before answering. "I do not know if I hate him, but I see him now, and I see you, and I choose you." And those words wrapped around me like armor, like grace, like forgiveness. I knew she still had her own wounds, her own questions, her own quiet grief, but I also saw how she carried it with strength and softness, and I was proud beyond words. One evening we got a surprise visitor. It was Marian, an old friend I had not seen since the trial. She had stood by me in small ways during the early days of the separation, but then life happened and we lost touch. She brought pie and a hesitant smile, and after Maya went to bed, we sat in the kitchen, just like old times, talking about everything and nothing. Marian told me she had been watching from a distance, afraid to intrude but proud, and I told her that her silence had hurt. But I also understood, because sometimes watching someone fall is easier than watching them rise. And Marian cried, and I cried, and we forgave each other. And in that kitchen, over pie and memories and quiet truths, we stitched another part of my old life back into place. Marian came by more often after that, and so did a few other friends, old neighbors, people I had once smiled at across fences or waved to during grocery runs. And I realized that maybe healing was not just about solitude. Maybe it was about rebuilding community too, about letting people back in, even if they had once looked away. Maya suggested we host a dinner not just for friends, but for everyone who had been a part of our journey, lawyers, neighbors, classmates, even people from courthouse. And at first the idea felt absurd. Who throws a party after a divorce? But then I realized it was not about the divorce, it was about survival and celebration and gratitude. And saying, "This is what it looks like when women refuse to be broken." The night of the dinner, the house was full. Laughter spilled from every room, food filled every surface, candles flickered in corners, music played low and warm, and I stood in the middle of it all, watching people smile, watching Maya laugh, watching old wounds become old stories. And I felt something shift deep inside me, something like closure, something like victory. Someone asked me how I managed to turn everything around, and I said I stopped waiting for someone to come save me, and I started building the life I deserved. And that answer spread like a whisper through the room, like a spell, like a blessing, and I saw heads nod and eyes shine. And I knew that even if they did not say it out loud, they understood. They felt it too that night, after the last guest left, and the dishes were done. Maya and I sat on the porch again, the stars above us, the quiet wrapping around us like a blanket, and she said, "I am glad you did not wait for him to apologize." And I said, "Me too, because I would still be waiting." And we laughed, not bitter, not broken, just free. In the days that followed, Maya prepared to return to school, and I prepared for the next chapter, not the end, just the next chapter. And as we packed her bags and folded clothes and wrote lists, I felt no panic, no sadness, just a calm knowing that we would always find our way back to each other, that no distance, no time, no scar could ever undo what we had rebuilt. On the morning she left, we hugged again, long and silent. And when she pulled away, she looked me in the eye and said, "You are the bravest person I know." And I whispered back, "You made me brave." And then she was gone, her silhouette disappearing into the crowd, and I stood there for a long time until I could not see her anymore. And then I walked back to my car, head held high, heart steady, because I knew this was not the end, it was just another beginning. After Maya had gone back to school, I stood at the threshold of the house feeling the quiet settle once again, but this time it did not feel like loneliness. It felt like a space I had earned, a stillness I had created with my own hands, and I knew I had come too far to let it slip through my fingers again, so I turned inward, not to retreat, but to reflect. I began writing, not in journals or diaries, but in letters to myself, long handwritten pages where I told the truth without flinching. I wrote about the mornings when I could not breathe, and the nights when silence screamed. I wrote about how much it had hurt to be ignored and how strange it had felt to be seen again. I wrote about the rage that came out of nowhere, and the peace that sometimes followed like a soft rain. And slowly I began to understand the shape of my survival. It was not clean or pretty, but it was mine, and it was real. I also started volunteering at a local shelter for women's survivors, not because I thought I could fix anyone, but because I understood what it meant to be broken, and to not know what healing would look like. I helped serve food, organized donations, and sometimes just sat with women who needed someone to listen. Not talk, not advise, just listen. One afternoon, I met a woman named Eliza, whose eyes looked like mine used to. She was quiet, shoulders hunched like she was trying to disappear. And during our first conversation, all she said was, "I do not know how to be okay," and I nodded, because I remembered saying those exact words once. So I told her, "You do not have to be okay, you just have to keep waking up." And she looked at me like that sentence was a key, and I realized how powerful truth could be when it was given gently. During this time, I also met with a counselor for the first time, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand why I had stayed for so long, and why leaving had felt like failure, even when I knew it was the bravest thing I had ever done. The counselor, a woman named Sharon with kind eyes and a soft voice, helped me unpack memories I had locked away. I told her about the first time he raised his voice, how it had come out of nowhere, and how I had convinced myself it was my fault. I told her about the birthday he forgot, the year he canceled our anniversary dinner to attend a company event, and how I had smiled through it all like it was nothing, because back then I thought being loved meant being silent. She helped me see that what I had endured was not just emotional neglect, but psychological erosion, a slow dismantling of my self-worth masked as normalcy. And the more we talked, the more I began to release the shame, piece by piece, not all at once, but in layers. Like peeling away old wallpaper to reveal the wall underneath. I also reconnected with my brother Tom, who had always been distant during my marriage, not because he did not care, but because he could not stand to see me diminished. We met at a small diner one Sunday morning, and the first thing he said was, "I missed you," and I knew he meant more than just time. He meant the version of me who used to laugh freely, who used to dream out loud. And we talked for hours about childhood, about family, about how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else when you are taught that sacrifice is love. And when we parted that day, he hugged me tightly and said, "I am proud of you," and those words echoed in my chest for days like a song I did not know I continued painting too, more than ever, in fact, and my work began to change. Instead of soft landscapes and quiet still life pieces, I started painting bold strokes, fiery colors, shapes that looked like storms and freedom, and everything in between. One gallery even reached out to showcase my work, and standing in that space, surrounded by people admiring pieces that had come from my pain, my joy, my resurrection, I felt something I had never felt before, not just seen but understood. One evening, while I was closing up the gallery, a man approached me. He was soft-spoken, curious about my art, and we ended up talking for a long time. His name was Adrian, and he was not flashy or intense, just kind and thoughtful. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself smiling, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks we met for coffee, shared stories, and slowly built something that felt nothing like what I had known before. There were no games, no silence, no disappearing acts, just conversations that stretched into the night, and laughter that felt like healing. I was cautious, of course. Scars do not vanish just because someone new arrives, but Adrian never rushed me, never pushed. Instead, he listened, he remembered the small things, and when I told him about my past, he did not flinch. He simply said, Thank you for trusting me, and that was enough. As fall turned to winter, I realized that this chapter of my life was not just about survival anymore. It was about rediscovery, about choosing joy without apology, about loving myself without condition. One afternoon, I received a message from Maya. She had been asked to speak at a conference about resilience in youth, and she wanted to include part of our story. She asked for my permission, and I felt tears spring to my eyes, not from sadness, but from pride, because my daughter saw me not as a victim, but as a warrior, and that meant everything. A few weeks later, I attended the conference and watched her speak to a room full of strangers with poise and strength. She talked about fear and courage, about watching someone you love reclaim their voice, and when she finished, the applause was thunderous, and I knew in that moment that everything I had endured had not been in vain. After the event, we went out for dinner, and she raised her glass and said to the woman who taught me how to rise, and I laughed through my tears, because I had never felt more alive, more whole, more free. The years that followed were not perfect, but they were mine, and that made all the difference. I built a new rhythm, one rooted in honesty and joy. I traveled a bit, took cooking classes, tried things I never thought I would, and through it all I carried the lessons of my past, not as burdens, but as reminders that I was not broken, just transformed. And every time I saw Maya grow in her own power, every time I painted something that captured a sliver of truth, every time I laughed without fear, I remembered that day at the graduation. The day he tried to break me and failed. The morning after that long phone call, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the mug in front of me, while the house felt heavier than ever, as if the walls had absorbed every fight, every silence, every betrayal, and were now pressing inward. I heard the faintest creak of footsteps upstairs, Maya still asleep, her door slightly ajar, and I knew I had to keep everything steady for her, because whatever came next could not shatter her. I had shielded her from enough already. So I stood up, forced myself to get dressed, and drove to work like nothing had changed on the surface, but something deep inside me had tilted forever. In the middle of my shift, while sorting paperwork, I received a text from Daniel saying we needed to talk, and I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Sure. Later that evening, he came home earlier than usual, his face unreadable, his steps hesitant, as he walked into the living room and sat across from me without looking me in the eye, and I knew he was about to deliver something rehearsed, something strategic. He began speaking in a flat, measured voice, saying he had been thinking a lot and believed it was best for both of us to take time apart, that he needed space, find himself, that the marriage had felt more like a duty than a partnership, and that he wanted to start over. And I listened silently until he finished, not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear all of it with clarity, no matter how painful. When he was done, I asked, "So you want a divorce?" And he nodded slightly and said, "Yes, I think that would be best." And I asked if there was someone else, and for a split second his eyes flickered, and that flicker was enough to confirm everything I suspected. But I did not press further. I just stood up and said, "All right," and walked out to the backyard, because if I stayed in that room a second longer, I would have screamed, not from heartbreak, but from rage and exhaustion. I sat outside until the sun dipped behind the trees, until the street lights flickered on, and the crickets took over the silence, and in that stillness, I told myself again and again that I would survive this, because I had already survived so much more. Daniel moved out the next week, packing his things in 2 quiet days, leaving behind the souvenirs of a man who had never really been present, old receipts, shirts that still carried his scent, books he never finished, and a drawer full of chargers for gadgets he never took with him. And when he left, Maya stood at the window, watching his car disappear, and said nothing, and I knew she was storing this memory somewhere deep, where it would not bleed immediately, but would scar later, and I wanted so badly to take that pain from her, to erase it, but I could not. All I could do was sit beside her, place my arm gently around her shoulder, and say, "I am here, and I always will be." For the first few days, the house felt cavernous, like the walls had pulled back, retreating from the absence that Daniel left behind. The air itself felt different. thinner, quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting for someone to scream or sob. But neither of us did. We carried on with routines, cooking meals, doing laundry, watching old sitcoms late into the night, pretending we were fine until pretending became easier. Then slowly, I began reclaiming the house. I started with the bedroom, removing his things one by one, folding them carefully, not out of care for him, but out of care for myself, as a ritual of release. I painted the walls a warm cream color, changed the bedding, bought a small lamp with a golden shade that gave off the softest light, and each change felt like a declaration: I exist, I matter, I choose. Then I tackled the living room, removing the heavy leather couch he loved, replacing it with a soft gray sectional I had always wanted. I added plants, photographs of Maya and me, artwork from local artists, and slowly the space began to feel like ours. Not his, not even mine alone, but something built from survival and intention. Maya noticed the changes and started adding her own touches: a blanket she crocheted during lockdown, a sketch she had made of our dog when he passed away, a string of fairy lights around the bookshelf, and every time I looked around, I saw not a broken home, but a healing one. At night, I began journaling, pouring my thoughts onto paper, raw, unfiltered, sometimes angry, sometimes grateful, often both. I wrote about the little things: how the silence felt less sharp, how the coffee tasted stronger, how Maya laughed more freely, and I realized that healing was not one grand moment, but a collection of tiny victories. One evening, Maya asked if we could have a movie night like we used to, so we made popcorn, pulled out the old blankets, and watched one of her childhood favorites. And somewhere in the middle of the film, she leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "I am glad he left." And I did not respond. I just held her hand, because that was enough. On weekends, I began visiting a community center near by. They hosted support groups, yoga sessions, and art classes, and while I was hesitant at first, I eventually joined a pottery class, and for 2 hours every Saturday I shaped clay into imperfect bowls and lopsided cups, and found joy in the mess, in the process, in the permission to create without judgment. There I met other women who had walked similar paths, and though our stories differed, our pain connected us. We shared laughter, tears, and recipes for survival, and in their company I felt seen, not pitied, not analyzed, just seen. I remember one session where we were asked to create something that symbolized freedom, and I made a cracked vase with wildflowers spilling out of it, not perfect but beautiful, and when the instructor asked me to explain, I simply said, "It is me." One day, while sorting through old boxes, I found a letter Daniel had written me early in our marriage. It was full of promises, dreams, plans for the future, and I sat there reading it, wondering where that man had gone, whether he ever really existed, or if he had just played a role long enough to convince even himself. And I felt a strange mix of grief and relief: grief for what never was relief, that I no longer had to pretend. And I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the edges curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. Then I stood up and opened all the windows, letting the night air sweep through the house, carrying the last traces of him away. In the months that followed, Maya thrived. She focused on school, joined a debate club, began volunteering at an animal shelter, and I saw her light returning, not all at once, but in glimmers. And I realized that while Daniel had left a hole, he had also made space we filled with love, honesty, and laughter. One Saturday afternoon, while grocery shopping, Maya asked if I would ever date again, and I laughed, caught off guard, and said maybe one day, and she grinned mischievously and said, "Well, I approve only if he has good taste in music and knows how to cook." And I smiled, because even that simple conversation was a sign of how far we had come, how far we still could go. We were not perfect. We still had moments where sadness crept in, where memories surprised us with their sting, but we were stronger, and every day we built something new, something real, something ours. The morning of Maya's award ceremony arrived with the soft rustle of wind through the trees outside, and a strange, peaceful quiet in the house that felt both promising and eerie, like the air before a storm. I had laid out my dress the night before, a deep blue one Maya had picked out with a proud grin on her face, saying, "Mom, you are going to look like a queen." I had smiled, then not expecting the phrase to echo so heavily in my mind. Now, as I fixed my hair, standing in front of the mirror, remembering the years of sleepless nights and long shifts and packed lunches and scraped knees and school projects and broken hearts and moments that shaped our journey together, and now we were here, the day that marked her stepping into her own world, ready to fly. I heard her voice from the hallway, cheerful and bright, as she adjusted her cap again, for the fourth time asking if her hair still looked okay. And I told her she looked perfect, and she did. She looked radiant, glowing from the inside out, her eyes sparkling with nerves and excitement, and that little trembling smile that reminded me of the child she once was, and the woman she was becoming. Daniel arrived right on time, his suit crisp, his smile wide but rehearsed, and I kept my tone neutral when I greeted him, and we posed together with Maya for photos. She stood between us, arms looped in ours, and for a second we looked like a family again, but the illusion broke the moment we stepped into the venue, the moment we were surrounded by rows of chairs, proud parents, cameras flashing, teachers smiling, and friends waving. Daniel stayed close, too close, his hand brushing mine, more than once his gaze lingering longer than necessary, and I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Maya, who waved at us from her assigned seat in the front row. As the event began, the speeches flowed one after another, stories of resilience, hard work, sacrifice, and success, and I clapped when Maya's name was announced, louder than anyone, because in that moment nothing else mattered. When she walked across that stage in her gown and tassel, with her shoulders back and head held high, I saw not just my daughter, but a testament to everything we had survived, everything we had overcome, and I felt pride that filled every part of me. She took her certificate, shook hands with the faculty, smiled at the crowd, and when her eyes met mine, we both knew this was more than ceremony. It was a declaration. When the event ended, Maya was whisked away by her friends for photos and hugs, and Daniel and I stood awkwardly near the exit, in silence. I was about to excuse myself when he said my name softly, and I turned slowly, and he looked at me with something unfamiliar in his expression, not anger, not detachment, but something almost like regret. He said I made a mistake, and I froze, not because I had been waiting for those words, but because I had finally stopped expecting them. I kept my voice even and asked what mistake, and he said leaving you, hurting you, not seeing what I had, and I stared at him, wondering if this was some twisted game, or if guilt had finally cracked through whatever wall he had built around himself. He stepped closer and said, I miss you, I miss us, and I know I do not deserve another chance, but I need you to know this. And for a brief moment the world tilted, and old memories tried to flood back, the good ones, the laughter, the shared dreams, the comfort of knowing someone so well. But they were just that, memories, and I had spent too long rebuilding myself to let them lure me back into a house built on cracks. I said, you left, Daniel, and not just physically. You left long before you packed your bags, and the damage you caused does not get wiped away with a confession. And he looked like he wanted to argue, but he stayed quiet and nodded. Then I said, you do not get to say this today, not on her day, not here. And he nodded again, slower this time, and stepped back, and that was when Maya appeared, walking toward us, her arms full of flowers, her smile bright and unbothered. And I knew I had done it. I had protected her joy, her moment, from the shadows trying to creep in. We left together, Maya and I, riding home with music playing and windows down, and laughter in the car. And later that night, as we sat on the couch with leftovers and stories about the day, Maya leaned her head on my shoulder and said, I saw the way you looked at him today. And I asked, how was that? And she said, strong. And I knew she meant it. I had spent so long questioning my strength, my worth, my decisions, but in that moment, with her head on my shoulder and the echo of applause still in my ears, I felt something solid and true. I had not just survived, I had grown, I had flourished, and so had she. We did not need anyone else to validate us. We had built something unbreakable. I tucked her in that night, kissed her forehead, and whispered, I am so proud of you. And she whispered back, I know, Mom, you showed me how to be proud of myself. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a warm quiet, a safe quiet, a quiet earned through storms and scars and stubborn hope. I walked into my room, turned off the light, and stood at the window for a while, watching the moonlight paint silver lines across the floor. And I thought about everything that had brought us here, the tears, the fights, the betrayals, the small wins, the healing, and I let it all wash over me, not as pain, but as proof. And I knew whatever came next, we would face it head on, because we were no longer surviving, we were living. The morning after the ceremony felt different, not just because of the silence, but because it held something heavier, something that sat in the air like an unspoken sentence, waiting to be finished. I woke up before Maya did, letting the sunlight creep in through the blinds, while the house slowly came alive around me. I moved quietly through the kitchen, boiling water for tea, not wanting to break the fragile calm that had settled since the night before. The memory of Daniel's words kept playing over and over, not because I wanted them to, but because they clung to the edges of every quiet moment. He had looked at me like he suddenly remembered something he had thrown away a long time ago, and part of me wondered what that meant for Maya, but a bigger part of me had stopped caring. I was not interested in going backward or reopening doors that had been shut for a reason. I just wanted peace. I wanted Maya to keep rising. I wanted the weight to lift a little, and maybe it finally had. Maya came into the kitchen barefoot, still in her pajamas, her hair a mess and her face glowing with leftover joy from yesterday. And when she sat at the table stretching and yawning, she said the ceremony felt like a dream. I smiled and handed her tea and said maybe it was the beginning of the real dream, the one she had worked for. She sipped and said, "You looked really happy yesterday." And I said I was. She looked down for a second, then up again, and asked, "Do you think Dad really meant what he said?" And I paused, not because I did not have an answer, but because I did not want to color her feelings with mine. So I said, "I think sometimes people realize things too late." And she nodded like she understood more than she should have. We talked about her plans, about what was next, about the friends she was going to meet, and the applications she was excited to send. And she kept talking while I watched her and thought how strange it was that the same girl I had carried in my arms now carried herself with so much strength and light. Daniel had missed so much of this, and now he wanted to return like a man knocking on a door he had once slammed shut. I would not stop Maya from deciding what kind of relationship she wanted with him, but I would make sure she understood what had come before, what he had done, how he had left, and not just physically, but in spirit, in attention, in loyalty, in love. I remembered all the nights I had stayed up wondering where he was, and all the excuses and the strange phone calls and the late returns, and how it all built up like slow poison. And now he stood there with eyes full of regret, but regret was not redemption. It was only the echo of what should have been later. That afternoon I got a message from Daniel asking if we could talk, just the two of us, no drama, no conflict, just a conversation. And I stared at it for a while before responding yes. But not at the house. I did not want that energy anywhere near Maya or the space we had rebuilt. So I chose a public cafe near the lake, the kind of place where emotions had to stay quiet, where no one raised their voice, and everything was served in soft tones and ceramic cups. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting near the window looking out at the water. And for a moment I watched him from outside, wondering how someone could look so familiar and so foreign at the same time. Then I walked in and sat down across from him, and he looked at me with a tired smile and said, "Thank you for coming." I nodded and waited. He started talking about the past, not the dramatic parts, but the small ones, the dinners we used to make, books we read together, the time we got lost on that hiking trail and ended up laughing in the rain. And for a second I felt that tug, the kind that memory plays on when it chooses only the highlights, but I shook it off because I remembered everything else too, the anger, the neglect, the way he made me feel invisible. He said, "I messed up. I know that now. I took you for granted, and I thought things would always stay the same, and I let my pride ruin something good, and I know sorry is not enough." And I looked at him and said, "You are right, sorry is not enough." And he said, "I want to make things right. I want to start again, even if we take it slow. I just want a chance." And I sat back and looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized that he still did not get it. This was not about starting over. It was about everything that came in between, about the years I had to carry everything alone, about birthdays missed and the lies told and the promises broken. I said, "Daniel, this is not about slow or fast or second chances. This is about what you walked away from and what you are trying to step back in to without understanding the damage." I am not angry anymore. I am not even sad. I just know what I deserve, and I know that version of us died a long time ago. He looked stunned, like he expected me to be softer, like he thought time had erased the sharp edges, and maybe it had, but not enough for me to forget. He nodded slowly and said, "I thought maybe," and I interrupted and said, "You thought wrong." And he sat back, looked out the window again, and said, "I understand, I really do," and I believe he meant it. But it did not change anything. We finished our drinks in silence, and when we stood to leave, he said, "Take care of yourself." And I said, "I always have, and I always will." I walked back home through the park, letting the wind brush against my face, and I felt a strange kind of peace, not relief, not victory, just a quiet knowing that I had faced what needed facing, and I had done it without falling apart that night. I made dinner with Maya, simple pasta and garlic bread, and we watched an old movie and laughed at scenes we had seen 100 times, and when she went to bed, she hugged me tighter than usual and said, "You are my hero," and I whispered back, "You are mine too." And later, when I lay in bed, I did not think about Daniel. I thought about the life ahead of us, about the calm after the storm, about the strength it took to rebuild, and the joy of watching someone you love grow into everything you dreamed for them. And more, I did not need validation. I did not need closure. I had already closed the chapter. I had already turned the page. The weeks that followed were quiet, not because nothing happened, but because everything that mattered had already happened. And now we were just living inside the aftermath of that storm, not broken, but rearranged. Maya was deep into her prep for college applications, writing essays, editing resumes, researching programs, reaching out to former teachers for recommendation letters, and building something that looked a lot like the future she had earned. And I watched her move through those moments with a kind of grace that did not need applause. She was a young woman who had already learned how to carry herself through emotional war zones and still come out with her light intact. Sometimes I wondered how different things would have been if Daniel had stayed, if he had shown up in all the little ways instead of just returning in one grand display at her graduation. But every time that thought came, I would let it pass like a cloud that did not belong in my sky anymore, and instead I focused on the now, the breakfasts we shared, the late-night talks, the quiet walks to the park, where we sometimes sat in silence, and sometimes laughed so loud it felt like we were echoing through the whole neighborhood. One morning, as we folded laundry, Maya brought up something I did not expect. She said, "Do you think he will ever stop trying?" And I looked at her and asked who, and she said, "Dad." And I paused because it was a valid question. Daniel had sent a few more messages, nothing dramatic, just check-ins, small updates. "How are you? How is Maya?" And once even a photo of a book he said reminded him of us. I never replied, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because silence was the clearest answer I could give to a man who only understood volume. When it was too late, Maya looked at me with those eyes that always searched for truth, and I said, "I think people only stop trying when they finally understand what they lost and know they cannot get it back." And she nodded slowly, like she was putting that thought somewhere in her heart. And I asked, "Do you want him to stop?" And she said no and yes. I do not know. And I understood that too, because love is complicated, especially when it is mixed with memory and disappointment. She was not asking for my permission, she was asking for space to feel both things at once, and I gave it to her without condition. A few days later, Maya was invited to speak at a community leadership event, a small panel for high school graduates who had overcome challenges and achieved something extraordinary. She asked me to come, and I said of course, and we got ready together like we used to for her school plays, doing her hair, choosing her outfit, me sitting on the edge of the bed while she adjusted her earrings and talked through her speech. And when we arrived at the event, the room was packed, not fancy, just warm with pride and full of other students and parents and teachers and mentors. And I saw Maya's name on the program and felt my chest tighten with the kind of pride that has no words. She was the third speaker, and when it was her turn, she walked to the podium with confidence, not arrogance, and she looked out at the audience and smiled, and then she began. She talked about obstacles, not in dramatic terms, but in simple ones, about feeling invisible, about finding strength through struggle, about realizing that sometimes the people who are supposed to support you are the ones who let go first, and how that pain can either break you or build you. And she chose the latter. She talked about the strength of mothers and how watching one woman hold everything together taught her how not to fall apart. And she did not say my name, but she did not have to. And I sat there holding my breath and tears and my hands so tight I thought they might bruise. And when she finished, the room stood, not just clapping but standing. And I knew that every tear, every lonely night, every fight for peace had led to this. I hugged her so tightly afterward, and she said, "Did I do okay?" And I laughed and said, "You did more than okay. You set the room on fire." When we got home, there was a letter in the mail from Daniel, not a text, not an email, a real handwritten letter, and I held it for a minute, debating whether to open it or toss it. And finally, I sat at the kitchen table while Maya took a shower, and I opened it. Inside were 2 pages written in neat hand, writing starting with "I know you probably do not want to hear from me," and ending with "I hope you find happiness with or without my presence in your life." And somewhere in the middle he wrote that watching Maya that day had broken something open in him, that he finally saw the full picture, not just the version he had told himself, and that he would always regret missing the years that mattered most. And though he wished he could rewrite time, he understood he could not. He said he had started therapy, something he had never done, and he was working on understanding his patterns, not for anyone else but for himself and for Maya, if she ever decided to let him in. And then he said something that stayed with me. He wrote, "I have learned that forgiveness is not something I deserve, it is something I hope for." And I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not because I wanted to save it, but because I needed to think about it, not as a wife, not even as a mother, but as a person who had once loved him and had once been destroyed by him. A few nights later, Maya asked if she could talk, and we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets under a sky full of stars. And she said he wrote me too, and I asked how she felt, and she said confused. She said part of her wanted to scream, and part of her wanted to ask why, and part of her just wanted to sit with him for 1 hour and say nothing. And I said, "You are allowed to want all of that, and none of it too." She looked at me and asked, "Would you be mad if I saw him?" And I said, "No, I would never be mad at you for seeking closure or clarity, but I want you to protect your heart." And she nodded and leaned into me, and we stayed like that for a long time. No words, just warmth and wind and all the things we had survived together. And in that moment I realized that healing was not a destination, it was a series of choices made over and over again, to stay open, to stay soft, to stay strong. And when Maya finally went to bed, I stayed outside a little longer watching the moon, thinking about how far we had come and how far we still had to go. But for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid of the journey because we were walking it together. The following days passed with a kind of delicate stillness, as if our lives were trying to rebuild themselves without making too much noise, and I could see Maya starting to carry things inside that she did not know how to say out loud yet, and I knew better than to push her, because silence sometimes held more answers than conversation ever could. And I kept myself busy cleaning, reorganizing the kitchen, scrubbing floors, as if by restoring order to the house I could restore it inside us too. And Maya spent more time in her room than usual, her laptop always open, textbooks spread across her bed. But I noticed that she was not just studying, she was reading through her father's letter over and over again, like she was trying to decode it not just with her mind, but with her heart. And one evening after dinner, she walked into the living room holding that same letter folded neatly, and she said, "Mom, I want to see him." And I paused because I had been waiting for this moment. But when it finally came, it still felt like standing at the edge of something I could not control. And I said, "Do you want me to come?" And she said, "No, I want to do it alone." And I nodded because that was the only answer love could give in a moment like that. And the next day she got dressed in her favorite jeans and a soft blue sweater, and asked if I could drive her to the coffee shop where they had agreed to meet. And the ride there was quiet except for the hum of the tires on the road. And when we arrived, she looked at me and said, "I do not know what I am going to say." And I said, "Then just listen." And she nodded and got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, and I stayed parked across the street, watching through the windshield as she stepped inside and disappeared into the soft glow of the place. And it felt like watching a door close between two timelines, the one where she needed protection and the one where she chose her own path. And I stayed there waiting, not moving, not listening to the radio, just letting every minute stretch like it carried the weight of years. And after what felt like a lifetime, she came back out, her face unreadable, her steps slow. And when she opened the door and got in, she did not say anything right away. She just looked ahead and said, "Drive." And so I did, and we went all the way home in silence until finally, as we pulled into the driveway, she whispered, "He cried." I said, "Did you?" And she said no, and she got out and went inside, and I sat there for a moment gripping the steering wheel like it might give me some strength I did not have. And when I finally went in, I found her sitting on the couch, her hands in her lap, her eyes dry but tired, and I asked, "Do you want to talk about it, and he said he was sorry over and over, and I believed him, but I still do not know what to do with that, and I said you do not have to do anything with it, you can just let it be, and she nodded and leaned back and closed her eyes, and we sat there as the day slipped into night. And I knew that this was just the beginning of something new, not a reconciliation, but a shift, a chance for Maya to rewrite the story on her terms. And a few days later, Daniel sent another letter, this time to both of us, and inside he wrote that he understood now why we had cut him off, that it was not revenge, it was survival, and he thanked me for raising Maya into someone strong and whole, and he said he would not write again unless she asked him to, that he respected the distance and the silence and whatever boundaries we needed, and that small act of letting go held more meaning than all his previous apologies combined, because it showed he finally understood that forgiveness was not a door he could kick down and not a prize he could demand. And around that time Maya started receiving her acceptance letters one by one, and every envelope she opened felt like a spark in the dark, like proof that no matter how messy things had been, she was still building something beautiful. And she got into 5 universities, and she chose the one by the coast where the campus was surrounded by trees, and the dorms looked like little cabins tucked into nature. And when we drove down to tour the place, we both fell in love with it, and she said this feels like a fresh start. And I said you deserve that and more. And when the time came to move her in, we packed the car full of boxes and clothes and books, and we drove for hours with the music loud and the windows down, and we talked about everything, and nothing like we were trying to stretch every second of time before goodbye. And when we got there, the campus was buzzing with other families and students, all tangled in hugs and lists. And I helped her set up her room, making her bed, unpacking her toiletries, hanging up the little lights she had brought, and when it was time to go, she hugged me so tightly I thought my heart might burst, and she said thank you for everything, and I said go make your life, and I drove away with tears in my eyes, but a quiet pride in my chest, because this was not the end, it was a beautiful beginning. And back home, the house felt different, not empty, just quieter, like it was catching its breath. And I went into her room sometimes just to feel close to her, running my fingers across her desk, or sitting on her bed, and remembering all the nights we had spent talking, laughing, crying. And a week later, a small envelope arrived addressed to me in Maya's handwriting, and inside was a photo of her standing on the cliffs behind her dorm, her arms wide open, the ocean behind her, and on the back she had written I am okay, and I smiled and placed it on the fridge. And then I went out for a walk, letting the wind hit my face, letting the world spin without trying to stop it, because I had learned that life was not about holding on too tight. It was about knowing when to let go with grace. And I still did not hear from Daniel, and that was okay, because some chapters do not need sequels, they just need closure. And I kept moving forward, building a life that was not perfect but peaceful. And I started volunteering at the local library, organizing story time for kids, reading to them with voices and laughter, and letting their joy fill up the quiet corners of my day. And on weekends I would visit my sister or have coffee with old friends, and slowly I felt myself expanding again, not because I was trying to forget, but because I was remembering who I was before everything broke, and who I had become after I put it all back together. And sometimes at night I would look at the stars and think about all the versions of myself I had been, the young hopeful bride, the confused betrayed wife, the fierce protective mother, and now just me, whole and healing and alive. Weeks passed, and then months, and life began to settle into a rhythm that felt both new and old at the same time, like walking through a familiar room that had been rearranged while you were gone. And I would sometimes find myself waking up early in the morning, expecting to hear Maya's footsteps in the hallway or the soft creak of her door, but the house was quiet, and I would sit by the window with my coffee, watching the sun come up and feeling the space she had left behind, not as an absence, but as a presence that had simply changed form. And I missed her every day, but I also felt proud every time she sent a picture of her dorm, or a video of the ocean, or a clip of her laughing with new friends. And I saved every message like it was a treasure. And one afternoon, as I was cleaning out a drawer in the kitchen, I found a small velvet box tucked behind some old takeout menus, and my hands froze When I opened it and saw the bracelet Daniel had given me on our 10th anniversary, a simple silver chain with a tiny heart charm, and I stared at it for a long time, not because I missed him, but because I remembered who I was before the lies, before the betrayal, before the public humiliation, and I realized I had come full circle, not in a neat way, not in a way that erased the pain, but in a way that acknowledged it and allowed me to move past it. And I put the bracelet back into the box and placed it in a drawer, not because I wanted to keep it, but because it reminded me that even broken things have a place. And around that same time Maya came home for the holidays, her arms full of gifts and books and stories. And we stayed up late the first night drinking tea and talking about everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. And she looked older, not in years, but in spirit, like the world had already begun to shape her into something sharper, something stronger. And she told me about a boy in one of her classes who made her laugh, and I smiled, because she did not say it like she was in love. She said it like she was discovering that it was possible again, and that was enough. And on Christmas morning she surprised me with a photo album filled with pictures of us from when she was little, from birthdays and school plays and random Tuesday afternoons. And on the last page she had written, "You were always my safe place," and I hugged her so tightly I thought I might never let go. And she said, "You taught me that healing is not about forgetting, it is about living." And I thought, yes, that is exactly it. And after the holidays she went back to school, and I went back to my routines, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer waiting for the next heartbreak, fearing the next disappointment. I was simply living. And a few weeks later I received a letter in the mail with handwriting I did not recognize, and when I opened it I found a note from Daniel's mother saying that Daniel had moved out of state and was trying to start over, and that he hoped one day we could all be at peace. And I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer as the bracelet, not because I needed it, but because some truths are better kept quietly. And in the spring Maya invited me to attend a presentation she was giving at her university, and I drove up with a mix of nerves and pride, sitting in the front row as she stood at the podium with her shoulders squared and her voice clear. And I watched her speak with the kind of confidence I had only dreamed of at her age. And afterwards she introduced me to her professors and her friends, and they all said the same thing: "She is brilliant, she is kind, she is going to change the world." And I nodded because I already knew that. And as we walked back to her dorm she slipped her arm through mine and said, "I would not be here if it weren't for you." And I said, "Maybe not, but you are the one who chose to keep walking." And we stood under the trees, letting the breeze wrap around us, and for a moment everything felt exactly as it should be. And I stayed overnight in a small guest room on campus. And when I left the next morning I looked back once more at her building, feeling that same mixture of joy and ache that had become familiar now. And the drive home was long but peaceful, and when I got back I found a small package waiting at the door, and inside was a keychain Maya had made in one of her classes, shaped like a little compass with the words "Keep Going" carved into the metal. And I held it in my hand for a long time, thinking about all the roads we had taken to get here, and all the roads still ahead. And I attached it to my car keys, and every time I reached for them I felt a surge of quiet strength. And one sunny afternoon I sat on the porch watching the wind move through the trees, and I realized I was not angry anymore, not at Daniel, not at the past, not even at myself for all the things I did not see, and all the ways I had bent until I broke. And I thought maybe that was the real ending, not a dramatic confrontation, not a perfect reconciliation, just peace, the kind that comes slowly and settles deep and stays. And I went inside and opened my journal, and for the first time in a long time I wrote not about pain but about hope. And I wrote about Maya and her laugh and the way she looked when she was determined. And I wrote about the day I stood in a courtroom and felt like the whole world had turned upside down, and somehow through all of it I had become someone I could be proud of. And I closed the journal and placed it on the shelf and stepped outside again, letting the sun warm my face and the birds sing their everyday songs. And I smiled, not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because I had survived, and that was enough. And months later, when Maya graduated from her university, I sat in the audience surrounded by students and parents and faculty. And as she walked across the stage in her cap and gown, I stood up and clapped until my hands hurt. And when she saw me, she smiled that same smile she had when she was a child, full of light and joy and resilience, and after the ceremony she ran into my arms and said, "We did it." And I said, "You did it." And she said, "No, we did." And we went out for dinner, just the two of us, and we talked about what came next, about her job interviews and her plans, and maybe even grad school one day, and I listened, soaking in every word like a melody I never wanted to forget. And that night as I lay in bed, I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed through the years, and I felt grateful for every single one of them, even the broken ones, because they had all led me here to this moment, to this peace. And I finally understood that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not anger or success or proving someone wrong. It is happiness, it is freedom, it is being able to look in the mirror and say, "I am whole, and I am still here, and I am not afraid." This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.